The Secretary of State has talked a lot about regaining global leadership, but I fear that he's stuck in 2009. He may not want to acknowledge this, but for the past 14 years, we've been a global leader. We are the only major economy, the only one to have halved carbon emissions since 1990. In that same time, America's emissions have stayed the same and China's have tripled. However, what we have seen is that countries are not persuaded just because Britain is going further and faster. They're persuaded by prosperity and they're persuaded by living standards. We are 1% of global emissions, and if he continues down the path he set out, I fear that our country will face hardship and there'll be no point in being world leading because nobody will want to follow our lead. He would make us a warning, not an example to others. So let's start with what he announced at COP. The Secretary of State has set out a new target to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 81% by 2035. However, what we didn't hear in his statement is how much this will cost the British people. The Independent Climate Change Committee say that this target would require people to eat less meat and dairy, take fewer flights, swap their boilers for heat pumps and their petrol cars for EVs at a pace that will require taxes and mandation. Even the chair of the Select Committee has acknowledged people will be forced to change their lives. But the Secretary of State says not to worry. He'll deliver all the savings through energy policy, and those plans will lead to higher growth, cutting bills, creating jobs and strengthening national security. But none of those things are true when it comes to his plans. The Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies has already said that his climate plans won't lead to growth. The National Energy System Operators Report showed that his rush for Clean Power 2030 is going to add eye-watering costs to our energy system. And despite those very expensive costs, it would still leave gas pricing the system around 50% of the time, or would leave the equivalent of millions of homes in the dark waiting for the wind to blow. I don't think that's anybody's idea of energy or national security. But, Mr. Speaker, he doesn't have to take my word for it. The head of offshore wind development at RWE, one of the country's largest wind developers, has warned that the Right Honourable Gentleman's rush to meet his 2030 target will lead to price spikes, with consumers losing out. The chief executive of Octopus has warned about the £6 billion of costs that consumers will have to pay because the Right Honourable Gentleman wants to build renewables without reforming the grid. And the former head of MI6 has warned that the Secretary of State, and I quote, this is worth listening to because it's their former head of MI6. The former head of MI6 has said, and I quote, that the Secretary of State is pursuing completely crazy energy policy when it comes to national security. And when it comes to jobs, his plans to make our energy expensive and unreliable will see jobs fleeing to more polluting countries because it's cheap energy and innovation which matter in the race for jobs. And you only need to ask China, which dominates clean tech supply chains and is the world's largest polluter. That's where billions of pounds of our taxpayers' money will be going to pay for his rush transition, from our country with all the investment it has made into clean power to a country still 60% powered by coal. Low growth, high bills, jobs lost, even blackouts, for more carbon in the atmosphere, Mr. Speaker. That's the opposite of what he's been promising. And in Baku, while he was signing us up to these targets without talking about what they will do for life for British people, he was also signing away billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. He signed us up to a $300 billion annual climate finance target, and I'm afraid it's not credible to say that taxpayers won't have to pay more, and they deserve to know by how much. So can he tell us today what that new target will mean for British taxpayers? And I think, considering the increase in the target, the public will rightly question why countries like Russia, and particularly China, now the world's largest polluter and second largest by historical standards, will not be obliged to pay a penny. I think he tried to insist that they would, but it's very clear that they will not be obliged at all to pay in. Whilst Britain, which has invested billions in cutting its own emissions and is only 1% of global emissions, will have to pay more. Well, he also set out an assessment on the increased reliance on coal-powered Chinese imports for his 2030 zero-carbon plans and what that means for global emissions. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State is not being honest with the British public. He promised them £300 of their energy bills by 2030, but just weeks ago he whipped his Labour MPs to vote that pledge down. He took away the winter fuel payment despite promising the elderly would be looked after under his energy policy. And he's now saying he can achieve higher climate targets in a way that's zero cost to the public. This is not a recipe for climate leadership, Mr. Speaker. It's a recipe for higher bills and lost jobs, and it will be a disaster for the British public.
Can I just say, just to